Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with an absolutely shameless infomercial about the books that I have written about music, because I have basically been told that if I don't do anything to promote them, nobody will. Certainly not the publisher, who at the moment is Rowman and Littlefield for the most part. The publishing business is just nuts. In fact, when I began my publishing career back in, what was it? Well, let's see, 1985 or 6 or somewhere around there. It was just on the verge of a crisis, which was absolutely as apocalyptic and weird as what happened in the classical music business. And I'll tell you a little bit about it just so you see that I got it on both sides. Let's put it that way. The first book that I wrote was my 25th birthday present to myself because I just wanted to do it. It was this one called Beethoven or Bust, a practical guide to understanding and listening to great music. Yeah, and I was 25 when I wrote it. When did it get published? I mean, it's not in print anymore, but you can still get it. It was published by Anchor Doubleday. And that was, let's see, I was born in 1961. Yeah, I know that part. And does it say, is the date? 1992 is when this thing finally came out. May 1992. Wow. Those were the days. But I wrote it quite a bit before. And therein lies a tale, let me tell you. The tale was as follows. I wrote the book and I found an agent. She was a wonderful lady who was totally behind the book. Her name was Anita Diamond. And I'll never forget her. She was an elegant woman of the old school. Let's put it that way. I mean, she knew everybody, and I just loved her. I thought she was wonderful person. She had a literary agency, and she placed the book, and she placed it with Prentice Hall. Remember, I don't think Prentice Hall even still exists, as a trade paperback publication. But at the time that this happened with Prentice Hall, I got a very good advance. In those days, they actually paid advances. I mean, serious advances, serious money, because they were going to actually promote the book. And it was going to be called the Prentice Hall Guide to Great Listening or to Great Music or something. You could see it. It got an ISBN number. And I actually sometimes see it on Amazon. It never actually existed, but the ISBN number did. So technically the book did. Anyway, Prentice Hall decided to close down its trade paperback division. And my editor, who quit as a result of this, was told to get the advance back somehow, to reject the book, and he wouldn't do it. He was a class act, and he got fired. So they hired someone else. So they hired this schlub, and this schlub got his mother, who was a grammar school or high school music teacher, to write a critique of the book, declaring that it was unpublishable, to destroy it, and by claiming that I was unqualified to say anything about music. I was appalled. I was horrified. And my agent called me in and she said, she had people working under her anyway, and the people in her office, and they said to me, listen, you got to defend yourself. We'll go to bat for you, but you have to defend yourself. So I stayed up all night writing a defense of every single point that this nonsensical person and his high school music teacher had criticized the book about. And it was all bullshit. It really was. It was complete nonsense. So I wrote the whole thing, and I'll never forget, in those days I was writing on an Apple Macintosh, those little things, the little, hard disk things, and there was a power surge and the whole thing blanked and I lost everything. And it was like 4:00 in the morning and I had to start all over again. And I was just in tears. It was a nightmare. So I wrote this whole defense of the thing again, and I submitted it to my agent, and they submitted it to the publisher, and the publisher was, hired a lawyer to sue me to get their advance back. I mean, it was just the most awful experience you can imagine. But Anita happened to also be the agent of a certain well-known writer. And I'm not going to name names because I think this well-known writer is still well-known. This well-known writer wrote sort of pulp fiction things. And this well-known writer was dead for many years, but this well-known writer was still publishing books, even though this well-known writer was dead. Because other people were doing it under the same name. It was a business, a franchise, just like, Elgar is now in the UK, things like that. Composers who are dead, they still write music. It doesn't matter. Well, it's been that way in the literary world for a long time. So she basically called them up and she said, you either drop this lawsuit or else you are going to lose this author who was like one of their major names, big, big, big moneymaker. And so they dropped it. And I had to find another publisher. And we had to start all over again. And we did. And it was Anchor, and they published it as Beethoven or Bust. And I was very proud and excited. And it was really a thrill for me. I still think this isn't a bad book, actually. And some of you have actually read it, have seen it. And so, and I appreciate that. And you've told me it didn't suck. So I was really happy. And after that, there was a very long fallow period until the 2000s, when I finally met somebody who I work with very, very intensively. That's Bob Levine, who is our opera critic, who was the best opera critic that ever lived in the history of humanity. Let me put this down. And Bob came from publishing. He was a book editor, and he was always looking to do projects based on music. And he's written some lovely books himself about Maria Callas and things like that, and on the topic of opera. And so he finally got a publishing house, which was Amadeus Press, and another one too. What's the other one here? Who are they? I don't even remember. With a couple series, you see him as the series editor, Robert Levine, and Continuum Books also. And they decided they wanted to do a series of books on music. And so Bob and I were already working together. And so he asked me to be part of the stable of writers that he put together in order to do these series. And I was like, yeah, let's go. And so I wrote 15 more books over the next decade or so. And it was really fun to do. And so I just want to take you through them now and tell you what they are, so that if you see them, you'll know. I will put the link to the publisher of these books, Rowman and Littlefield, which is most of them, not the two for Continuum, but all the others, at the bottom of this video, so that you can get onto that website and see where you might find them if you can't find them on Amazon, because I don't know what's going on. I just don't know what's going on. The publishers are a disaster these days. And these books are problematic because originally some of them were issued with accompanying CDs, and they don't make them with CDs anymore because Amadeus Press was sold to Hal Leonard, which was sold to Rowman and Littlefield, and the CD licensing arrangements were apparently done through the earlier entity, and they may not have carried over, or if they're not pressing a CD, they were supposed to put them as downloadable files online, and some of them they got, and some of them they didn't, and it's a mess. The books themselves, I think, are fine. I really do. But I just want to warn you in advance that I don't know if the music that accompanied them originally will be there, although you can really do it yourself very, very simply. It's not a big deal, in my view, anyway. But, if they see that they're still promoting them, take that with a grain of salt if they say the music comes with them, because I can't be sure. I just don't know. Some of them had them, some of them didn't. But there are, first of all, 2 books with Continuum Press that were sort of one-offs. Continuum also was another publisher, basically, I think, an academic publisher. They did nothing to promote these books. They didn't care. None of these people cared. They issued them, and then nothing happened. It's crazy to be sitting on a pile of books that you don't promote, but it's exactly the same situation that we have with the classical music business, with the CD business too. All of the impetus is in producing the product, but there's no impetus in actually selling the product, in telling people that it exists. So if I don't do it, nobody will. Hence this infomercial, where I can do it all in one spot. And I have mentioned these books in connection with some other videos, but it's kind of tiresome to be sitting there talking about a composer saying, oh yeah, get my book on this composer. So maybe if I put it all in one place and you guys are interested enough, someone will watch it. I don't know. So one of them is this one. This is Beethoven, just the 5th and 7th symphonies. I thought, this was an interesting project for me because these are small books, which I dropped again, easy to read, and 100 pages or so, 122 pages. I think the best thing about this book is the introductory essay called 9 Ways of Looking at the 9, how to deal with the Beethoven symphonies and why they were important. I think that's probably a pretty valid essay, and I enjoyed writing it. I enjoyed the whole book. But, that's a little book. But just to get the 5th and 7th symphonies, I don't know. You'd have to just love the way I write so much, I think, that you want to hear what I have to say about them. And if you don't feel that way, I understand. Next, we get the Brahms symphonies. This I like. I had a big discussion about this with several Brahms scholars about my approach to the Brahms symphonies. I think this says some very, very interesting things about Brahms as a symphonist. And I did a lot of research for this little book. There's a lot of thought that went into it. And, well, you can read it and see if you agree with how I feel and what I say about the Brahms symphonies and how best to listen to them and how wonderful they are and why they're wonderful and what makes them special. But then I'm not taking these in order now. I'm just going by, they're sort of in a stack and grouped in certain ways. First, there are the books on the Second Viennese School composers. This is the one of which I am probably most proud, Exploring Haydn, a listener's guide to music's boldest innovator, which is what Haydn was. Holy mackerel, this book was just a joy. I've never had so much fun. It really is. And one of the coolest things about this book is that at the end, whether or not you get the CDs, and there were 2 of them originally, you get these charts that I put together, and they are really handy, cool things. I have to tell you, I'm being shameless, like I said. This is shameless. You get appendices that list all the symphonies and all of the string quartets and all of the piano trios and all of the piano sonatas, all of them. And not just in order and what they are and by number and key, but also by their attributes, what their form is, what their unique characteristics are, things that end with slow movements or things that have, certain fascinating aspects. For example, the symphonies are characterized, and it tells you for each one, and I do this all the way through, what they have by their orchestration. Symphonies in 3 movements, symphonies in church sonata form, symphonies with high horns in C, symphonies with prominent concertante parts for various soloists, symphonies with slow first movement introductions, symphonies that end with Haydn's signature of 3 repeated chords, symphonies with adagio movements, symphonies that have the minuet play second, whether they're early, whether they're late, I do that with all of these works. So if you like a certain thing, you can find it very easily. And I think that's pretty useful. And I got news for you. There isn't anybody else who's done that I've seen, at least in the same way, by those sort of musically intrinsic characteristics and points that you may, as a listener, look for. So I am very proud of this and very proud of what it says about Haydn and how to listen to him. I mean, it was a labor of love. All of these were, but this was a labor of super duper love. It really was. If I die and only this survives me, I'll be happy. I really will. I'm really proud of that book. Then there were 2 volumes on Mozart. And these are some of the books that I am, it's not a question of being proud of, that I'm happiest to have written, because I always preferred Haydn to Mozart. I knew Mozart was great, but I always liked Haydn better, just personally. But there is no way, I think, to appreciate the greatness of a composer who you know is great intellectually than to write a book about them and have to make the point in a compelling way. And I just came to adore Mozart by writing these books. One of them is about vocal music, the operas and other things, and the other is instrumental music. And, it was a wonderful, wonderful, rewarding exercise for me to be able to listen to all of this Mozart and discover just how fabulous a composer he was. Now, some of you may think that that's stupid. Everyone knows Mozart's fabulous. Everyone has told you that Mozart is fabulous. But there is a difference between somebody telling you and you being ashamed to admit that you disagree or not really understanding why everyone's telling you that and coming to feel it in your viscera. And my viscera now vibrate beautifully in tune to the music of Mozart as a result of having written these 2 books, which I think was wonderful for me. And I hope the experience is also great for listeners, because I think it's useful to write a book about a great composer that doesn't start with, well, everybody knows he's great, so we're going to take that for granted. To have to explain why they're great, what makes them great, what makes them special. To start with a clean slate and say, well, if you've never heard this guy before, this is what you should listen for. And that's what I try to do in all of these books, whether I love the composer or don't love the composer as much as I love the other composer. So those are the 2 Mozart books. Then, finally, after having done Beethoven's 5th and 7th, I did Beethoven, the orchestral music. This was, I think, the last one that I wrote. It was actually the last one that I wrote, I believe. And I'm very happy to have done this because it rounded out my talk about the Second Viennese School composers. And I do think that this offers a certain personal slant on Beethoven. Some of you have already mentioned that you have this book and that you're reading it, and I appreciate it very much. If any of you have purchased any of my books, I'm very grateful, and I thank you. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. But this was just a natural outcome of the Haydn and Mozart books. And I think having done them, it put me in a very good frame of mind in which to tackle Beethoven. And it was fun to write a book just on the orchestral music because so many people, you can drown in a topic that's this big. With a composer who wrote so many masterpieces. And if you have to do the symphonies and the quartets and the trios and the sonatas, and you wind up either writing something that's, a monstrous volume, or you don't give anything really the treatment that it needs, that it deserves. So I think limiting myself to the orchestral works really gave me an opportunity to give sufficient coverage to all of the works that I'm talking about. These are the pieces people are most interested in anyway. Let's not kid ourselves. So there you go. So there's Beethoven. Next, let's see. Oh, yeah. Now we come to a group of four books that I really, really felt very strongly about. It's a group of works by composers who I call the outsiders. And the outsiders were composers who either were not German or who were German but who were not German by virtue of the fact that they were Jews or something like that, some outsider faction writing music which was banging at the gates. They were the barbarians at the gates. They were the ones demanding entry into the great world of German symphonic and orchestral music. And they were being regularly denied entry by the powers that be. And their music was personal and extraordinary, and it was their own slant. And because it was different, they were excluded. And the purpose of these books was to show how they became legitimate, what's the word? Followers or participants, let's say, participants in the great German tradition of orchestral and instrumental music from the 19th century on, whether or not the Germans wanted them to be there. Because the issue is not what the Germans thought. I couldn't care less what the Germans thought or how they were treated in their lifetime. What fascinates me is how they were able to speak there with their own personal voice and take what they needed and transform it into something that was absolutely special and wonderful and unlike anything else. And because of that, they actually renewed and continued that line of composition, even though the Germans didn't want to admit it. And they continued it even when it had ceased to be a valid or legitimate thing to do in Germany. And oh my, what a wonderful sort of concatenation of names. And they're very different. The first one, who will come as no surprise to any of you, was Mahler. This was the first of the books that I wrote for Amadeus Press. This one just popped out like Athena from the head of Zeus. And I'm not comparing myself to Zeus, but I mean, I got the contract for this book and it was done in like a month. I mean, it was like Handel writing Messiah. I mean, this one just poured out. It was really just something I had been wanting to write about for the longest possible time. And it was a total thrill to be able to do it. And oh my goodness, I still love it. I still love the topic. I still love Mahler, as so many of you do too. And like all of these books, this is called an owner's manual. That was my idea. It was my sort of characterization of the whole series. Some other books by other authors were also called owner's manuals, I believe. But the whole idea is just a sensible guide to listening to the music. What do you need to get you through the pieces? What are the high points? What are the things that are noteworthy and that you should listen for? And along the way, I had a wonderful opportunity to talk about all kinds of fun subjects, about Mahler's Sixth and the order of the movements and things like that I'd wanted to talk about for a long time. And Mahler's unique way of expressing himself. There's a whole appendix here, like in the Haydn book, that has characteristics of Mahler's symphonies, marches and dances, screams, crashes, and thuds, which were sort of signposts that Mahler used for structural purposes. You can't call them tunes, you can't call them motives, they're just screams, crashes, and thuds. Then there's an aspiration or redemption theme that he used. And then there's humor, his own particular strange humor. And then, how he handled large-scale structure. All of that was very, very interesting to me. And I got to talk about it in the book about Mahler. And he was the first of the outsiders. The second outsider was Dvořák. Dvořák, another composer who I think is pitifully underrated, horrendously underrated, tragically underrated, whatever adjective you want or adverb you want before underrated, it applies to Dvořák. Possibly the greatest composer of any of them in the second half of the 19th century, in my opinion. The most versatile, and I think I say that here, romantic music's most versatile genius. That was Dvořák. And this was wonderful because I got to talk about all kinds of things that people don't talk about in Dvořák, like his operas, a bunch of which are absolutely magnificent, his choral works, and all the things that he did. Such an astonishing range of masterpieces and terribly, terribly underrated. So Dvořák is the second of the outsiders who was demonstrating that he was a sponge. He could take influences from anywhere and make them all come out like Dvořák and demonstrate thereby that a Czech musician, a musician who was not part of that German mainstream, or an opera, the Italian mainstream, could have an equal right of participation because he was a genius and he wrote masterpieces. So Dvořák is also another one of those that I really, after Haydn, it may be, the one that I kind of love the most because it just talks about the most music, how fascinating all of that music is. And after Dvořák, there was Sibelius. And with Sibelius, not only is Sibelius fascinating by himself, because he was such a great composer, but he's fascinating in context because he sort of invented Finnish music. I mean, he really did. He invented a whole style, a Kalevala style that gave Finnish mythology its musical voice. And it has nothing to do with folk music, real folk music. Real folk music is a whole different thing. It was invented by Sibelius. And because Sibelius did this, and because Sibelius was so amazingly tied in with Finnish national culture, he influenced a huge number of fabulous composers who came after him. And I thought one of the glories of this book would be the fact that I have, after various chapters, little paragraphs where I talk about his followers or the ones who came after, other worthy Finnish composers who took up where Sibelius left off. Because there's just a whole wonderful school of composers. You know who they are. There's Matatoya and Merikanto and Radhavara and Kalevi Aho. And, there's Einar Englund, and I mean, just lots of them. Jonas Kokkonen, a fabulous school of composition arose directly as a result of the impact of Sibelius on Finnish music. And I thought that would be really cool for people who wanted to not only figure out and learn about Sibelius and how to listen to Sibelius and what made him special, but to explore further this fabulous school of virtually unknown music. Oh boy, was I wrong. This was such a lesson. I got all these comments, like on Amazon and other places, saying, well, I just wanted a book on Sibelius, and he talks about other people. Well, maybe I spend 10 pages out of like 200 and something talking about those other people. Big deal. And I had in the accompanying CD a Sibelius disc and a disc of on the second CD of all of these other people. So you could sample it. If you liked it, you could, you didn't like it, don't listen to it. You liked it, listen to it. I thought, what could be the harm? I learned something very, very profound about marketing and sales, which is what people want a thing, they want the thing. And it doesn't help them to give them more. It's just bewildering for some people. They don't want to deal with it. They don't want to think about it. If people want to read about Sibelius, they don't want to have any side remarks at all about anybody else. I was shocked. I was a little disappointed, to be honest with you, because I thought people would find the idea of Sibelius as fascinating as his music. And what happened, how it inspired all of this other great music. I think it's such a wonderful story. And I still do. So I think the Sibelius part of the book is fine. The other part is, I think, fascinating, but not everyone agreed. And it was really a one of those teaching moments for me. It really was. You got to stay focused on what the reader is going to want, I guess, even if you disagree, which sucks. Well, okay. And then the last of the outsiders was Mendelssohn. Now, Mendelssohn, it's hard to think of Mendelssohn as an outsider, isn't it? Because he was so integral to Romantic German music in the early decades of the 19th century. And he was deified in England and the US and other places too. He was such a representative. He founded the Leipzig Conservatory. He was so central to German Romantic music at the beginning of the 19th century. However, the fascinating thing about Mendelssohn is that he became an outsider. He started out right there, smack dab in the middle, trained millions of musicians who wrote tons of horribly boring faux Mendelssohn afterwards. The Reineckes and all the R people. They wrote lots of this stuff. But then, when nationalism really got going, they all decided, well, Mendelssohn was Jewish, even though he was raised from an early age as a Lutheran and was a devoted Lutheran his whole life. It was a racial issue. He was born a Jew. He looked like a Jew. He sounded like a Jew. There was something Jewish about him. And he became an outsider. He became an outsider to the point where, of course, his music was banned by the Nazis completely in an attempt to totally rewrite 19th century history. And it just goes to show that, whether you are or aren't an outsider has nothing to do with the music you wrote or the importance you had or what. It was all about nationalism and politics and racism and things that were completely unmusical. And I'll never forget reading, a book of, Furtwängler's writings. Ugh, horrible. He was an idiot when it came to philosophy and things like that. Say what you will about him as a musician. And he gave a speech after the Second World War that was sort of like, yeah, okay, I guess we can consider Mendelssohn a German composer after all. And it was one of the most embarrassing things anybody ever thought up. It was just so, well, I don't need to, you can fill in the blanks. It was horrifying is what it was. And Furtwängler thought he was being like complimentary and fixing an ill by saying, well, gee, okay, even though he was Jewish, yeah, okay, we can say he was German. Oh, boy. No, thank you. If that's what it takes to be a member of this club, I don't want anything to do with it. And that was why one of the reasons I found Mendelssohn so interesting. And the other reason I wanted to write about Mendelssohn was because, of course, he's generally disregarded these days. There's still that picture of him as this sort of effete, aristocratic, wealthy, Jewish, not genuine composer. And he was incredibly passionate, incredibly genuine. He happened to be brilliant and good at everything and an unbelievable prodigy. But he was, an incredible genius. But he was not the facile, sort of lightweight dandy, Victorian dandy that he's made out to be. And so this was a wonderful way, I thought, to redress that very commonly held prejudice against Mendelssohn that arose as a result of this huge intervening period in which he was made an outsider. What an amazing thing. The politics and the history of what happened to this music is so interesting and so important because it so often replaces the act of listening. And when you do listen, the music tells you something completely different. So you have to be able to listen without prejudice. That's the key, isn't it? So that's what those 4 books about the outsiders are kind of about. Listening without prejudice and letting the composers speak to us. And boy, do they have something to say. Oh, God, it's so rewarding. So after that, I did Shostakovich. And this is not in chronological order, but Shostakovich. Now, this book fascinated me for a lot of reasons because you know how much bullshit there is about Shostakovich. All the talk about Shostakovich was the secret messages that he encoded in his symphonies and and how it was all about Stalin and misery and suffering and great music, and it is about misery and suffering. Don't get me wrong. And then his socialist realist stuff. But what I heard was a musician who had an unbelievable feeling for symphonic form. I mean, you realize no two large works by Shostakovich have exactly the same overall shape. When he was writing his string quartets, every one of them is in a different key. You know, he was work when he died, and he was young when he died. Remember, he was in his late 60s, early 70s. He was on his way to creating cycles of works, none of which repeated themselves. None of them. There are no two in any genre which have the same basic shape. And so I wanted to talk about Shostakovich's symphonies as music and as form, and to try and show just what an amazing symphonic genius he was. Because he had what symphonic geniuses have, which is a genius for form, for putting together huge, important, variegated symphonic utterances. And he really did. He really did. And I think this book, his Symphonies and Concertos, shows how he did it and what he was up to. And I still think, frankly, that the literature on Shostakovich is almost all biographical. There is so little that I've seen. I may not have seen enough anymore because I'm not in the academic field and I'm not a specialist in any of these composers. So I don't know all the scholarly literature. I know what the popular literature says. And so when I say that I'm talking more about the popular literature, they don't get into the musical details. They talk about Stalin, and I don't care about Stalin. I care about what Shostakovich wrote and how he wrote it and what makes it special and what makes it fascinating and powerful and emotionally gripping. And that is his handling of symphonic form as a symphonist or concerto writer or whatever. So that's what the Shostakovich book is about. And it does have, like most of these books do, little summary, where you get summary of the individual movement forms in all of the symphonies. That's Appendix 2. What's Appendix 1 here? Oh, Appendix 1 is a huge chronology of all of his works and where the symphonies fit into them. But it's important. It's important to see just how variegated they are and how Shostakovich took each new work, even the socialist realist works, as a new challenge, as something absolutely unique to that specific work, and came up with formal solutions that fit that specific work. I think that's really cool. Then I did Leonard Bernstein, which I was also interested to do. You're getting the trend here. I'm trying to promote composers, when I write these books as often as not, who are disregarded for one reason or another. And I don't need to go into Bernstein in detail. You know why. This was Bernstein's orchestral music in Owner's Manual, because Bernstein was and is looked down upon because he was, first of all, a genius conductor, and second of all, he wrote Broadway musicals, and third, because his music is theatrical and overtly emotional, and he was also a brilliant composer. And I just wanted to make that point by discussing these orchestral pieces one thing at a time. I mean, just to give a tiny superficial taste of just how thoughtful his orchestral writing was, Bernstein had a specific concerto orchestration that he used and that worked wonderfully well. He did it for the Serenade, in Plato's Symposium for violin and orchestra, and the three meditations for Mass for cello and orchestra, and Hallel for flute and orchestra. Those are his three big concertante works, and they are all scored for strings, harp, and percussion. Now, that is an absolutely unique ensemble that Bernstein came up with for these concertante pieces, and it turns out to be fabulous as a medium against which a solo, one which has a lot less strength than the full orchestra, can expose itself. And that's just an example of the thoughtfulness that went into his planning of these works. I wouldn't call it formulaic. It's special. It's unique to him. It's his voice. And I think there's a lot about Bernstein's voice that is not discussed that I have an opportunity to talk about in the Bernstein book. So that was fun to do. And then let's see what else we got. Oh, we got three more. I'm sorry if this is running long, but there was a bunch of it. What can I tell you? Yeah, Richard Strauss. Now, Richard Strauss was like Mozart. This was a book I wanted to write because I didn't really like Richard Strauss. And I really wanted to like Richard Strauss because I recognized what a genius he was in his operas like Salome and Rosenkavalier and whatnot, and Die Frau und Schatten. I mean, I love them, but I found the orchestral works to be full of dead spots and bad timing. And I still think they have a lot of dead spots and bad timing, to be honest with you. But But following his entire career, from where he started to where he wound up, and then to what happened to him during the Nazi period and his late flowering at the end of his career, the music he loved most, which was Mozart and the Viennese classics, it was a moving story and a very interesting one. And I learned, again, it forced me to listen in a way that I would never have had an opportunity to normally, to listen and explain, to talk about what I was hearing. And my God, what a wonderful therapeutic thing that was. Now, I'm not saying that you should worry about my psychological hangups and music therapy. What is fascinating is the opportunity to see Strauss's work whole over the course of his career. And really the big discovery in this book for me, out of Strauss, was really paying attention to the late operas, the ones that nobody likes, the ones that always get trashed, because Strauss wanted to be the German Offenbach. He wanted to write comic operas. He knew that comedy was his specialty, that he wasn't going to be terribly good at writing deep, profound, sublime, transcendental music, even though that's what German composers were supposed to do. And, that's why nobody pays any attention to these late operas, because they are funny, and because he's German, and funny Germans, funny and German, they don't go together terribly well. Not after Haydn and earlier part of Beethoven. After that, it all became so serious, and Strauss didn't want to be serious. And that was a big problem for his career. That's why his career took the path that it did. And it was a difficulty that he never fully resolved. But there's some unbelievably great music. I mean, Die Schweigsame Frau is a masterpiece. There's some really great comic operas, and we really ought to hear them. We should hear them more often, and I encourage people to listen in this book. And so I was really happy to have the opportunity. Again, the joy of this is to be able to really focus on the music and then to try and describe it, to put into words what I'm hearing and why it's great and why other people should listen, and to invite people into that special world. Next, two earlier composers, because most of what I did is romantic, late romantic, 20th century. That's where I was coming from in terms of my own musical discoveries and training and education and experience, which is why I wanted to do Handel. Oh, was this fun. Of all the books that I've written, I think this was the most fun. And the reason I think it was the most fun is because Handel is the ultimate musical, what's the word? He was a voluptuary, is what he was. In food terms, they said he was a glutton, but he wasn't. He was just reveled in pleasure. He was so entertaining. Unbelievable. Everything he touched turned into pure joy. Even the stuff that was serious and heavy duty. In this respect, he was the absolute opposite of Bach. And I really think that Handel has been totally misunderstood by even the period instrument folks in terms of what he was after and what he was doing. Because he was a hedonist, a total musical hedonist. It's fascinating, that when people listen to his music, they just don't understand just how luscious and how much he just revels in the joy of what he can do musically. And it doesn't matter whether it's Messiah or the oratorios or the operas or whatever it is. There's just that unbelievable joy in making music, and it's extraordinary. And it just gushed out of him. Really, really cool. So this book was fun because I had fun. And I think that comes through in the writing. It's a funny book, I have to say. And I really just loved treating Handel that way, instead of, the way the English people do, as, sort of a, national treasure. He's a national treasure. And the Victorians, with the moral element. And the moral element is there. But there's nothing wrong with being moral and having a good time. And that's sort of the point. So this was fun to do, my goodness. And what I wanted to put across in this book is just how much fun Handel is to listen to. Just how enjoyable, purely enjoyable it is, without you having to worry about the fact that it may be a biblical text, or that, it's a Baroque opera seria with endless da capo arias and all that. You forget about all that. Just have fun listening to it, because it's marvelous. And because Handel was one of the great musical humanists. his characters, his operatic characters, they're vivid and they're real. And they're real because they have feelings that he's able to project, whether they're happy or incredibly sad and tragic. He just had the most unbelievable human touch. You know, 2 notes of a Handel aria, and you know who you're dealing with, you know how they feel. And I think Handel is a miracle. I really do. I find him far more appealing and entertaining than Bach. I still do. I have no problem saying that. And that's what I wanted to convey in this particular book. It was just unbelievably fun. And I know it's not going to get any attention, and the Handel people aren't going to care, and people will treat it as unserious. And I know all of those things, but it covers a heck of a lot of music. From early Handel in his earliest days in Italy all the way through to the end. And I think it does it in a way that makes a tremendous amount of very unfamiliar music approachable to people who simply love music. There you go. So, and finally, last but not least, another book of which I have great personal fondness. I really do. This was a labor of love because I know it's not going to sell. I know it's not going to buy it. And I was so grateful that the publisher actually let me do it because it was the CPE Bach year. So it allowed me to do it. I mean, it's I don't know. CPE Bach was such a great composer. In his day, he was, of course, considered far more famous than his dad, the great Bach. But CPE was every bit as good in his way and totally different. And frankly, it is to the father's credit, his eternal credit, that the music that his kids wrote was so masterful, but at the same time so completely unlike his own. He knew great music when he heard it, and he knew he was not the only person writing it. He knew there were different styles. And CPE Bach was the avatar of, the classical period, of the new emotional expressiveness of music. His music is so interesting, so consistently interesting. Some people dump on it and they say, well, it's just a bunch of, formless emotional eruptions that are put together randomly. That's so not true. So not true. And his keyboard writing is, by modern standards, thin and difficult because the instruments he wrote for, most likely the clavichord and also the harpsichord, are by modern pianistic standards, instruments which are require a different sort of technique. But it sounds marvelous on the piano, and this was fun. A listener's guide to the other Bach. I mean, this is another thing where I had this opportunity. I was lucky because the record industry helped me. They did, Anna Markovina did the complete CPE Bach keyboard works. There was that Bis cycle of CPE Bach, all the harpsichord concertos, all the keyboard concertos coming out with Spani, playing. And I didn't like all of them, but my goodness, at least they're now available. Tons and tons of music. And I was involved in that. I was involved in some of these recordings being made available because I was able to put the performers, for example, at Hensler and SWR Music, in touch with the CPE Bach edition that's being produced by the Packard Humanities Institute. And the Packard Humanities Institute makes available parts and in scholarly editions to all of these performers for free. So all of it became possible. And there was the great discovery of the old Bach archive that was returned at last from, it had been sitting in the Ukraine or in Poland or someplace where the Russians stole it after World War II. And now it's back in Berlin. And all of this music that was thought lost has now been rediscovered, and it's in the process of being recorded. And the reason I wrote this book is because CPE Bach for us today, it's as if we're discovering a great new composer. One that nobody knew, one whose music was completely unknown. For most people, CPE Bach is as good as music that was written last week. It's contemporary. It's a new discovery. It's only been possible in the past couple of decades to really discover this music. And I wanted to get on top of it and write a guide. And I'm so happy to have had that opportunity. And that, my friends, is the complete Dave collection of books. It's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of stuff. And, whether you buy them or don't buy them, I just want to document the fact that they exist because I have no idea what's happening in the publishing world. As I said, there is a link to Rowman and Littlefield where I know that these books are available for purchase. And I wouldn't worry about whether or not the music that comes with them is available. I know that that's a selling point and whatnot, but you can find the stuff, or you can just talk to me, and I'll tell you what records to get. It's all wonderful music. It's just been a wonderful part of my life. I do have another book sitting out there. It's Bruckner, actually. It's done. Almost done. There's like a half a chapter to go that I sort of stopped, and I'll figure out what to do with later. I really, was looking to do it, but I don't know what's happening with the publishing industry. I really don't. Everything seems to have stopped dead. And at least as far as this series goes that I've been working under. And so I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe I can self-publish. I don't know where the world is going in the world of publishing. It's a mess. It's just as a big a mess as the classical music record business. In some ways, even more of a mess. And I had the great good fortune to be wading hip deep in both messes. And so that's why I wanted to just take this opportunity to share it with you. And I really appreciate your watching and letting me blab on about, the books that I've written. But I'm proud of them. I'm really proud of them. I think that hopefully, along with these videos and these other things, it will add up to the legacy of somebody who, at least whether you agree with me or disagree or like me or hate me, you can say, I really loved the music and wanted to share what I loved about it with you. And so thank you so much for joining me. Keep on listening and reading. Take care.